Imagine you're standing in your kitchen. The pot is simmering, steam rising, the air thick with the scent of your dinner. You reach for a small pinch of salt, just a few grains, barely worth a thought. But 200 years ago, that same pinch could have cost you a day's wages. In British India, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was a symbol of control. Every grain was counted, taxed, and owned. You paid once when you bought it, and again when you dared to use it. This right here is the story of how a simple pinch of salt built an empire and quietly broke millions of lives. Salt was never meant to be political. It was life itself, needed to preserve food, to keep the body alive in unbearable heat. But the empire saw something else in it: opportunity. Salt doesn't rot, doesn't vanish, doesn't spoil in the sun. It can be stored, measured, and taxed. And that made it perfect. In a land where half the population lived by the monsoon, salt was the one commodity that didn't bow to the seasons. The British understood that, and they turned it into their most quiet weapon. Before the empire's accountants arrived, salt was free. Families boiled seawater along the coasts. Traders carried it inland, and every region had its own flavor, its own salt routes, its own customs. But when the British established their rule, they brought something new: paperwork, licenses, tariffs. They claimed the right to control every grain extracted, transported, or sold. They said it was to maintain quality, to organize trade. In truth, it was to ensure that no one could taste freedom without paying for it first. The price of salt was no longer just what you saw on the market shelf. Hidden beneath it was a labyrinth of taxes, tariffs, and bribes. A family that earned 5 rupees a month could spend a tenth of it just to afford basic salt. Imagine a handful of crystals costing as much as a loaf of bread or a new clay pot. You paid the merchant, and behind him stood another man, a tax collector, his hand outstretched. That's why they called it the salt you paid twice for, once in silver, once in silence. It wasn't just money, it was dignity. The empire had found a way to make survival itself taxable. Every meal, every preservation jar, every sip of buttermilk was another invisible payment to London's treasury. And yet, most people didn't even know it. The tax was woven into life, invisible as the salt itself. You didn't see it, you tasted it. Picture a small home in Bengal, the mother cooking, the children waiting, and beside the hearth, a tiny cloth pouch of salt, carefully folded, rationed, guarded. Every pinch mattered. They'd stretch that small supply across weeks, sometimes months. When it ran out, the choice was brutal: buy more or eat bland. Those who lived far from the coast paid even more. The farther the salt traveled, the more the empire charged. The government literally made geography a tax. The system was elegant in its cruelty. First, the British banned locals from producing salt independently. Only licensed factories, supervised by the colonial bureaucracy, could legally harvest or sell it. Anyone caught making salt without permission faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. So people adapted. They learned to cheat the system, to smuggle salt across invisible borders. At night, families would carry sacks of crystals through marshes and forests, avoiding patrols. Smugglers were not villains. They were survivalists, risking everything for a taste of the forbidden. One of them, an old trader named Karim, once said, "They don't let us breathe without paying for the air." Soon they'll tax that too. He wasn't far off. For every 10 pounds of salt harvested, nearly half the profit vanished into taxes and administrative costs. The government kept meticulous ledgers: how many ounces were boiled, how many carried by train, how many sold at market. Salt had become a bureaucratic obsession. Inspectors roamed villages, breaking pots, confiscating salt, destroying livelihoods. A handful of crystals could now be evidence of a crime. Meanwhile, for the empire, the numbers were beautiful. The salt tax alone accounted for almost 10% of the colonial budget. It funded railways, docks, police forces, and courts, the very tools that kept the system running. Every paved road and polished courtroom floor carried the taste of salt money. The irony was bitter. The poor man's kitchen funded the rich man's table. By the late 19th century, the injustice was so obvious that even British newspapers whispered about it. A tax on the necessities of life, one columnist wrote, is a tax on the breath of a nation. But nothing changed. Too much revenue, too much comfort for those in power. The bureaucrats in Calcutta sent their reports to London, proudly showing how efficient the salt monopoly had become. Order and discipline, they called it. In truth, it was dependence and despair.
Salt was rationed not just by weight, but by loyalty. Government employees, soldiers, and favored merchants often received discounts or special access, while villages suspected of unrest were starved of supplies. Salt became an instrument of punishment. Imagine a system where rebellion made your food tasteless. It's absurd, but it worked. When your family's survival depends on a few ounces of mineral, politics becomes personal. Yet under this suffocating control, something unexpected began to form. Quiet resistance. Housewives began to gossip in markets. They take our salt, but they can't take our will. Traders found new routes. Fishermen traded in whispers, and contraband salt became a symbol of dignity. It wasn't about flavor anymore. It was about freedom. The British didn't see it coming. Empires rarely do. In the cities, people paid twice for salt and grumbled once. In the villages, they said nothing, but remembered. That memory simmered like a pot on low fire, slow but unstoppable. And when it boiled over, it would reshape the empire itself. But that part comes later. For now, the world kept turning, the ledgers kept growing, and the pots kept boiling. Think about what it means to own something like salt. You can't fence it, you can't patent it. It's nature's gift. Yet in British India, it was property of the crown. The law said so. That's the genius of colonial economics, taking what everyone needs and turning it into a revenue stream. They didn't have to conquer your village with guns, they just conquered your kitchen. For many families, salt became a measure of social class. Wealthy homes in Calcutta could afford imported rock salt, pure and white, served in crystal bowls. Poorer households used coarse, grayish crystals, often mixed with dust, sometimes with ash. The difference in color became a quiet symbol of inequality. Their salt is white, ours is brown, people would say. But it wasn't just color, it was power. Every meal reminded you who ruled and who obeyed. In some areas, people tried to make their own salt again, secretly. Along the coast of Odisha, small groups of villagers would build makeshift pans at night, boiling seawater under the stars. They knew the risk. If caught, they could lose everything. But for them, a handful of illegal salt was an act of defiance. It meant, for one dinner at least, they ate on their own terms. The empire called these people criminals. History calls them free. You can trace the trail of salt across every part of colonial life. The merchants who transported it paid fees at every checkpoint. The porters who carried it were searched, sometimes beaten, always taxed. Even temples and monasteries had to report their salt use to district officers. The smallest indulgence, a pickle, a preserved fish, was part of an invisible accounting system that reached all the way to the British Treasury. And yet, to the British public, India was the jewel of the crown, profitable, peaceful, progressive. The propaganda worked. They printed colorful posters showing happy Indian families enjoying government salt, safe and clean under the Union Jack. No mention of the arrests, the hunger, or the burnt salt pans. No mention that behind every smiling face was a hidden debt. The numbers were staggering. In the 1880s, the salt tax collected from India equaled almost a third of Britain's defense spending. Think about that. The very money extracted from Indian kitchens helped finance the soldiers who kept those same kitchens under watch. Empire feeds on itself. It's easy now to see salt as trivial. We take it for granted, cheap, endless, available everywhere. But back then, a shortage of salt wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a slow disaster. Without it, food spoiled faster. Workers grew weak in the heat. Children fainted from lack of minerals. Salt was the line between nourishment and sickness, and that line had a price tag. By the early 1900s, the resentment was deep. Markets buzzed with rumors of corruption, of salt officials taking bribes, of British officers eating imported salt while locals were fined for gathering their own. People laughed bitterly, saying even our tears are taxed. It wasn't a joke. In 1903, in a district of Gujarat, a group of women were arrested for washing salt from dried lakes without permission. They claimed they were just cleaning their pots. The empire called it smuggling. And through all of this, the same ritual continued. The pot boiling, the mother reaching for the pinch, the family eating quietly, not realizing that with every bite, they were funding the empire that watched over them. Salt didn't just flavor their food, it flavored their fate.
In the countryside, the story of salt was whispered like a warning. Travelers told tales of men caught with just a few handfuls of unlicensed salt, dragged before the magistrate, fined more than they earned in a month, sometimes beaten. Everyone knew someone who had lost their farm, their donkey, or their dignity over a sack of salt. The empire had found a way to criminalize necessity itself. In the small towns, markets turned cautious. Merchants weighed every transaction, hiding small bribes in folded paper. A tax officer could appear at any time, demanding receipts. And yet, corruption was a quiet secret everyone shared. For a coin slipped into the right palm, inspectors could look away. Salt became a shadow economy, a dance between survival and obedience. The British loved to boast about the order of their system, but under that polished order was pure chaos, sustained by fear and greed. In Calcutta, the officials wrote reports full of numbers, pounds produced, barrels shipped, revenue collected. They never mentioned the human cost, but you could see it in the faces of the workers, thin, burned by the sun, hands cracked from brine and heat. In every grain of salt, there was a drop of sweat and maybe a drop of blood. The empire built its roads and railways with money drawn from this trade. Ironically, those same railways carried the salt that people could no longer afford. A farmer could watch trains full of white crystals pass by his village while his own family ate unsalted rice. The tracks gleamed, but they carried more than cargo. They carried humiliation. For the British, this was efficiency. For Indians, it was absurdity turned normal. You woke, worked, paid, and went to sleep inside a machine that charged you for being alive. That's how power hides itself. Not in big speeches or banners, but in habits so small they seem harmless. Every pinch of salt was obedience disguised as routine. And yet, beneath that routine, something old and dangerous was waking. A question began to form in the minds of ordinary people. If salt comes from the sea, who gives the empire the right to sell it back to us? That question spread faster than any decree could suppress. It traveled from village wells to factory floors, from bazaars to temples. The answer was obvious, but no one dared to say it aloud, not yet. In Bombay's harbor, sacks of imported salt arrived daily, stacked high, guarded by soldiers. The salt was pure, white, branded as imperial quality. It was a product and a message. This is the salt of civilization, the mark of empire. Meanwhile, inland salt was branded as native, inferior, dirty, unsafe. People were taught to mistrust their own produce, to crave what the rulers sold. It wasn't just economic control, it was psychological colonization, a reshaping of taste and pride. But not everyone bought the illusion. In the alleys of Surat, small traders started labeling their local salt freedom salt. It wasn't official, it wasn't legal, but it sold, quietly. Word spread. "Buy the salt that doesn't shame you," they whispered. For the first time, the kitchen became a place of rebellion. In the households of clerks and soldiers, conversations grew sharper. "They feed us wages and take it back in salt," one man said to another. They laughed bitterly, but the laughter had teeth. Anger was seasoning itself, grain by grain. Even nature seemed to mock the empire. Storms destroyed coastal salt pans, floods erased borders between legal and illegal zones. Every time the monsoon came, the empire's tidy records washed away. But the bureaucracy started again as if nothing had happened. Order must be restored. Revenue must flow. The ocean didn't care for licenses, but the empire did. Then came the droughts. In some provinces, salt production fell sharply. Prices soared. Families bartered grain for salt, jewelry for sacks. Children grew sick from lack of sodium. The government responded not with relief, but with tighter control, claiming to prevent chaos. That's when people began to see clearly. The chaos was already there, disguised as order. By 1910, salt had become a quiet political symbol. Everyone knew it was wrong, but no one could fix it. The empire had laws, armies, prisons. What did the people have? Just their kitchens, just their hands, just their will. But sometimes, that's enough.
And then came the stories. A widow in Bihar boiling seawater at night, caught and fined. A fisherman in Madras beaten for selling homemade salt to his neighbors. The whispers turned to outrage. "Is there nothing left that's ours?" someone shouted in a market. "Not even what we eat?" The rebellion that would come years later, the marches, the headlines, the history books, started here, in moments like this. Small, unrecorded, but powerful. The idea that tyranny could live in something as simple as taste. The realization that freedom could begin with flavor. Meanwhile, the empire continued counting its coins. London loved numbers more than faces. They wrote reports that praised the salt tax as a model of administrative success. It was neat, predictable, profitable, the kind of cruelty that looks good in a spreadsheet. No blood, no noise, just numbers. That's what made it so dangerous. When oppression hides behind paperwork, it's almost invisible. But invisible things are the hardest to kill. The resentment of millions was quietly crystallizing, just like salt itself. And one day it would be mined, lifted, and thrown back at the empire. In cities, the new middle class began to question. Newspapers printed cautious editorials, poets wrote verses disguised as folk songs. Teachers told students, "Freedom begins with knowing what they've taken from you." For the first time, ordinary people realized that the empire's strength depended on their obedience to trivial things. If you stop buying their salt, maybe you stop believing their lies. But still, fear held many silent. After all, the empire punished not just the rebellious, but their families. A husband jailed meant a household starved. So people resisted quietly. They saved crumbs of forbidden salt like treasure. They cooked with pride and secret. Every grain tasted like defiance. Then came a strange irony. British officers began to complain that the locals were losing respect for law. They were right, but they didn't understand why. When law is built on injustice, losing respect for it isn't rebellion, it's sanity. Even the British soldiers stationed in India began to question the system. Some saw the absurdity firsthand. They paid less for imported salt in their mess halls than the villagers paid in markets. One officer wrote in his diary, "We rule a land where salt is a weapon." That sentence never made it into the official record, but it survived. Someone kept it, someone remembered. And still, the system continued, as if the numbers mattered more than the people. Each month, reports crossed the ocean. Salt output steady, revenue consistent, stability maintained. It was the illusion of peace, a silence bought by fear and fatigue. But silence, like salt, dissolves. Soon, cracks began to appear. Local councils protested the monopoly. Merchants demanded reforms. Intellectuals called it a moral crime. The empire responded with committees, papers, polite promises. Nothing changed, because salt was too valuable. It wasn't just a commodity, it was a symbol of control. Lose the salt, lose the grip. In the villages, people had their own way of describing it. "They season our food with chains," one elder said. That sentence spread faster than any law. You could hear it whispered in markets, murmured in fields, repeated in songs. "They season our food with chains." That's when everything began to turn. The idea that a pinch of salt could taste like slavery. The moment when an ordinary person looked at the most ordinary thing on their table and realized, it isn't really mine.
There's a moment in every long injustice when people stop being afraid and start being ashamed of how long they obeyed. For British India, that moment began with salt. It started with murmurs in the bazaars and ended with footsteps echoing across the country, because salt, the smallest thing, carried the largest truth. You can't own what belongs to everyone. In the early 1930s, the air grew tense. The empire, proud and polished, seemed untouchable. But inside, its foundations were hollow. The salt tax had become more than a policy. It was a wound. And into that wound walked a man with no weapon but will. Gandhi didn't choose guns. He chose salt. When he began his salt march, many British officials laughed. "He's marching for seasoning?" They joked. They didn't understand the genius of it. Salt was not a condiment, it was a key. By walking 200 miles to the sea, Gandhi wasn't defying a tax, he was unlocking a memory. He was reminding every farmer, every mother, every trader, this injustice began at your table. Take it back there. End it where it started. As Gandhi bent down and lifted a handful of salt from the shore, the world gasped. Cameras clicked, but for millions in India, it wasn't news, it was vindication. The empire's great lie had finally been named aloud. A man could now stand in the sun, hold up a crystal of salt, and say, "This is mine." That gesture was so small, and yet it cracked the empire open like lightning splitting stone. The British reacted with panic disguised as order. Raids, arrests, thousands jailed for making salt. But something had changed forever. The fear that kept people quiet had evaporated. Salt had become sacred again, not because it was holy, but because it was theirs.
A woman boiling seawater in a clay pot was now committing an act of revolution. The empire had always relied on control through habit, train schedules, tax forms, polite obedience. But salt broke the spell. For the first time, the people realized how fragile the empire's power really was. It depended on compliance. Take away the fear, and the whole machine rusts. Even British newspapers could no longer hide the truth. Headlines spoke of the Great Salt Protest, of India's March of Conscience. They tried to be neutral, but the imagery was too powerful. An old man barefoot walking toward the sea with thousands behind him, it was biblical. No empire can survive a symbol like that. But this story isn't really about Gandhi. It's about the millions of nameless people who had been paying twice for salt their entire lives. The march was their echo. The freedom was their flavor. And the world began to see what India had known for decades. Tyranny can hide in the smallest details, in ledgers, in laws, in what you put on your plate. When independence finally came, the salt tax was one of the first relics to fall. The ledgers were closed, the licenses canceled, the guards withdrawn. For the first time in generations, families could boil seawater again without fear. Housewives laughed as they stirred the pans. Children tasted the first pinch of free salt and found it sweeter than sugar. Rarely does freedom taste so literal. But the story doesn't end with a parade or a flag. It lingers quietly in the way we still live. Because control never really disappears, it changes shape. Today, the taxes are hidden in other things: fuel, medicine, food. The system still finds ways to make us pay twice for the things we already own, for the air we breathe, the water we drink, the illusion of choice. That's why this story matters. The salt you paid twice for is not just history, it's a mirror.
Every empire begins by selling people what they already have. They tell you they're protecting you from chaos, or quietly selling you back your own freedom, one receipt at a time. Salt was just the prototype. Think about your own life for a moment. The subscriptions, the bills, the service fees, the promises that convenience comes at a small cost. It's always a small cost, until it's not. That's how systems grow, by hiding their weight in everyday habits. The British called it governance. We call it progress. Different words, same recipe. The people of British India learned something the hard way. The real revolution doesn't start in the streets, it starts in the mind. The day you realize you're paying twice is the day the empire begins to tremble. Close your eyes and imagine that kitchen again. The same one from the beginning. The pot still simmers, the steam curls upward, and the same pinch of salt falls from your fingers. But now, there's no taxman behind you, no ledger, no permission slip, just the simple act of seasoning your food on your own terms. That's what freedom looks like when it's real. Not grand speeches, just peace at your table. Salt built the empire, and salt ended it. That's the circle of history. What's used to bind people eventually teaches them how to break free. Empires don't die when armies are defeated. They die when the smallest act of control becomes absurd. When people laugh at it. When a pinch of salt becomes a revolution. That's the moment the British Empire began to crumble. Not with gunfire, but with laughter, defiance, and the sound of waves on the Indian shore. And maybe that's the lesson we should all remember. Freedom isn't something you win once and keep forever. It's something you protect every day. In your choices, in your thoughts, even in your kitchen, especially there. So the next time you sprinkle salt on your food, pause for a moment. Feel the history between your fingers. Somewhere, long ago, someone paid for that pinch with courage. Someone refused to pay twice.
If this story made you think, share it. Leave a comment below. What's the salt in your life today? The thing you're paying twice for without noticing. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden economies that shaped our world, subscribe to Everyday Empire. Because history isn't just in books, it's right there on your table.